The lament that we find at the beginning of chapter 9 begins a few verses back at 8:18. The first line sums up the tone. My joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick. Then in verse 19 comes the reference to my poor people, which recurs in verses 21, 22, and then chapter 9, verse 1. This verse contains the most powerful imagery for his grief. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. The picture is of someone exhausted with grief, no longer able to physically produce tears, but crushed and racked all the same. A moment ago I said his grief, but I haven't said whose grief this is. Commentators are divided, and there have been a number of options argued for. The most obvious candidate would be Jeremiah, who has been the other voice so far in this book apart from God. His grief would be very natural, as is the repeated phrase, my poor people. Also, the mourning is described in very human terms, with tears pouring out of a head. Most of the more popular English translations insert headings before 8:18 to clarify who is speaking. The NRSV has, the prophet mourns for his people. The NLT has, Jeremiah weeps for a sinful Judah. ESV has, Jeremiah grieves for his people. The Good News and the New King James also have similar headings. But the NIV and the New American Standard leave the text as it is and offer no guidance or opinion. Some scholars, however, argue that it is the Lord himself giving out this lament. In 8:19, the speaker asks, is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? Admittedly, either Jeremiah or God could have asked this rhetorical question, but the next line is this. Why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their foreign idols? Now only God can say that. And verses 2 to 3 of chapter 9 change the tone sharply. The speaker stops expressing sorrow and longs to leave for some desert lodging to get away from my people. Most of the time in Jeremiah, it is the Lord who uses the phrase my people, as he has already done so a number of times in chapters 2, 6, 8, and here in 9. Then, as verse 3 continues the accusation, it finishes with, and they do not know me, says the Lord. It appears that the Lord has been speaking all along. If this is the case, it means we have the most extraordinary example of God's pain expressed here in poetry. We remember that in chapter 5, God was so reluctant to bring destruction on his people. But this goes to another level. Here we appear to have God grieving in very human terms. Read again 8:18. My joy is gone, grief is upon me, my heart is sick. And 8:21. For the hurt of my poor people I am hurt, I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. And, of course, 9:1. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. Can this really be God talking? Earlier there was the familiar prophetic imagery of God accusing an unfaithful wife. We are certainly meant to understand God not just as an angered husband and king, but one who is hurt and betrayed and very long-suffering. It is possible, then, to understand God as feeling both anger and pain. But is this lament too much? Does it make too hard to reconcile God's wrath and his suffering? Does it make him too conflicted? And is the imagery just too human? Another interpretive option is that it is both Jeremiah and God speaking. The prophet speaks first, expressing great grief, and then the Lord interrupts to remind him why this calamity is happening. The conflict then is actually within Jeremiah. He is torn between delivering these words of fire and what that will actually mean when the conflagration rages. Jeremiah speaks in 8:18 and the first sentence of verse 19. Then the Lord injects for the rest of verse 19. Jeremiah resumes from verse 20 to 9:1, but 9:2 is unclear. My guess is that it is still Jeremiah talking, but now he is coming through this overwhelming moment of grief and is remembering the situation behind it. The Lord speaks again in verse 3. The reason I've spent so much time on this question is that it is easy to pass over significant moments like this lament, especially when most of the popular translations have steered you in a particular direction. But the possibility that it is God grieving here ought to be considered, as not only is the language incredible, but it shows God suffering alongside his own sinful people. It reminds us of God's grief before the flood and Jesus' lament as he overlooks Jerusalem. And in Luke's Gospel, when he is carrying the cross to Golgotha, he says to the wailing women, "Do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children," because he knows of the coming judgment. As I said, though, I am not convinced that God is speaking all these words, but it is certainly worth considering. I can't comment on much else or the video will be too long, but particularly noteworthy are verses 23 to 26 of chapter 9, which Paul must have reflected on before writing Romans 2. Here, as there, you have the theme of boasting, particularly what is appropriate boasting, and the comparison with the other nations on the question of circumcision. All this draws attention to what really matters before God. Lastly, chapter 10 contains a poem about the foolishness of idols compared to the everlasting Creator and his uniqueness, which is very similar in theme and imagery to Isaiah 40, particularly from verse 18 onwards.